Hi guys, I'm Miss Rubino. If some of you don't know me, hi Junior. So we're so excited today to get started with George Elbaum. He's a Holocaust survivor. A lot of you might have heard of his story by now. You know all about the Holocaust. You've been really well educated, so you know how amazing it is that we get to have him here today to tell his story to you. So please be respectful. I don't want to see any phones, headphones, earbuds are away. He will be available to answer some questions at the end of his talk if any of you have some questions you'd like answered, and we would encourage you to ask some questions. I don't want to waste any more time talking. So without further ado, Mr. George Elbaum.
Can you hear me back there? Good, okay. Good. First of all, I'm very glad to be here. I know about you guys through Zoom for the last 4 years, and it's nice to see all you guys in person. It's really nice to be here now with COVID over. Anyway, I'd like to tell you about the world that I was born into, a dangerous world that I survived, but only because of major luck, and a world that I hope none of you ever have to experience. The place, Warsaw, Poland. The time, September 1939. Hitler's Nazi armies invade Poland, and that starts World War II. With hundreds of airplanes, next. Thousands of tanks, next. 1 million troops, next. The Nazi army sweeps across Poland and conquers it in 1 month, next. Then they hold a victory parade on the streets of Warsaw, next. And even Hitler himself comes to view it. That's Hitler with his arm outstretched. Now, I was born in Warsaw. I lived there at the time, but I don't remember this because I was only 1 year old. But I remember most things since I was 3. And at that time, when Hitler invaded Poland, I had a family of 12 people, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. Within 3 years of that moment, out of the 12 people, only my mother and I were still alive. The other 10 were all dead, murdered by the Nazis. Why? Because they were Jewish. As you probably know, the goal of the Nazi Party, the stated goal, was to exterminate everyone who they considered undesirable. Jews were on top of the list, but there were others, gypsies, invalids, gays, socialists. But Jews were on top of the list and the largest group. And at that time, when Hitler invaded Poland, there's about 3.5 million Jews living in the country. By the end of the war, 5 years later, out of that 3.5 million, 90% of them, 9 out of 10 were dead, murdered by the Nazis. What became known as the Holocaust was the murder of 6 million Jews during the 5 years of the war. Now, 6 million is a huge number. I can feel physically, I can't feel what 6 million really means, and you probably can't either. So I'm going to try to put that into more human terms, a number that you can perhaps feel. Let's, for the moment, think about averages. 6 million murdered in 5 years, that is 1.2 million every year, or 100,000 every month. That means that on the average of those 5 years, the Nazis were killing 100,000 Jews every month. That's still a big number. But here's a big number that you probably can't feel. Population of Boston, it's about 600,000. You probably, when you go into Boston, you know the feeling of what 600,000 people means. Well, at the rate of 100,000 Jews killed every month, that's equivalent of killing every man, woman, and child now living in Boston every 6 months and repeating it 10 times over. Thank you. I can't blow it. Okay. Is this better? Okay, good. So essentially, 6 million is equivalent to killing every man, woman, and child in Boston 10 times over. There's never been murder, killing of that magnitude in the history of the world. Now, in addition to the cruelty and inhumanity of murder on that, what I call industrial scale, you can ask yourself, how is it possible to do that? How is it possible, how is it possible to kill everyone living in Boston every 6 months and repeat it over and over 10 times? Well, the Nazis were very efficient, at least when it came to the process of murder. And the way they started this process was by establishing what became known as the ghettos. Essentially, in each of the countries they conquered, they chose 1 or 2 and maybe 3 major cities. And in those cities, they already had a sizable Jewish population. And in those cities, they focused on the Jewish neighborhood. And in that neighborhood, they established the ghetto. Now I'll just be talking about the Warsaw Ghetto. I lived there, I was born there, I remember that. And it was by far the largest and the most populous of the ghettos, and therefore the highest number of people that were murdered from it. So in Warsaw, the Nazis focused on the Jewish neighborhood, and they chose a very small part of it. They chose like 2% of the area of Warsaw, whereas the Jewish population of Warsaw was not 2%, it was 30%. So therefore, most of the Jews who lived outside of the small 2% area, which became the ghetto. They built a wall around it, a brick wall with barbed wire on top, with gates that were guarded by soldiers with machine guns and dogs. And once the wall was erected, the Nazis swept the 98% of Warsaw around this small walled-in ghetto, collected all the Jews that lived there, and forced them all into the ghetto. And then they swept the whole countryside of the whole Warsaw region, the smaller cities and towns and villages that also, some of them had Jewish populations, 20, 30, even 50%, collected them all and forced them all into the ghetto. So think about it. If you have, let's say in Boston, population 600,000, what if you put a wall around so many blocks that have 100,000 people in it? So there's 500,000 people outside of the wall, and you force them all in. Where do these people stay? There's only room for the people already living there. That's exactly what happened in Warsaw. And I remember, so where did these people go? There's no room for them. Well, I remember I was about 3 years old, and the people who were lucky, because they had friends or relatives living in the ghetto, they would move in with them. And I remember I was 3 years old, suddenly like a dozen strangers moved into our apartment. At that time, only my mother, my grandmother, and I were living there, because the men in the family, my uncle, my grandfather, etc., they've all been taken away by the Nazis, and they were all dead by then, but we didn't know about it until after the war. So these strangers that moved into our apartment, they were sleeping on the couches, on the floor, in the kitchen, in the hallway. And I remember asking my mother, who are these people? What are they doing here? And my mom said, well, they're friends. They'll be with us for a little while. And they were with us for a little while, whatever that might mean to a 3-year-old. But once the Nazis felt that they collected Jews from the 98% of Warsaw outside of the wall, and from all the small villages and towns and cities around, they started taking people out of the ghetto, out of the small walled-in ghetto, putting them on trains, shipping them to concentration camps, and most of them to the gas chambers. So rather than telling you about it, I'm going to read to you a chapter from a book that I wrote, 13 years ago. The book is called Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows. And if we have time, I'll tell you that I was inspired to write this book after I kept the Holocaust at an emotional distance. I was silent about it for 50-some years. The chapter I'm going to read to you is called Umschlagplatz, which in German means shipping point or collection point. Now, I do not speak German. I never did. And the first time I heard the word Umschlagplatz was when I was 4 years old. I'm 85 now, so that was 81 years ago. I've never forgotten that. Umschlagplatz. Suddenly there was loud shouting coming from the courtyard. Then the entire apartment complex was filled with ear-splitting noise. Shouts, screams, doors banging everywhere, and heavy running footsteps. My grandmother ran into the room holding my coat, grabbed my hand, and led me to the staircase, which was filled with people, all going downstairs. When we reached the courtyard, it was already full of people crowded together in groups, with soldiers in dark green uniforms, shouting orders and walking between the groups. My grandmother held my hand tightly as we were pushed back and forth by the crowd, till finally we were standing at the edge of our group, facing a large arched entry gate that led from the street into our courtyard. It seemed that we stood there a long, long time, and I remember being glad that my grandmother put my coat on me because I was getting cold. And I remember seeing some groups being led by soldiers out of the courtyard through the big gate. Next slide, please. This is the scene that I remember having. You see the people being led out from the big gate and the soldiers guarding them with machine guns. Then suddenly I saw my mother running in through the gate, holding a piece of paper in her hand, showing that paper to some soldiers, talking with them, and finally coming to us, to my grandmother and me, and leading us out of the courtyard. It was only years later, after the war, that I understand what happened. The Nazis were emptying out the Warsaw Ghetto apartment block at a time and shipping the residents to concentration camps. My mother, who at that time was working at a factory in the ghetto, which the Nazis authorized the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to manage and make uniforms for the Nazi army, my mother somehow learned that our apartment block was being emptied out that day. And she got from her factory director, an official document allowing her to keep her family in place. With this document, in effect, a temporary permit to continue living. Think about that. That little piece of paper was a temporary permit for my mother and my grandmother and me to continue living. With this document, my mom managed to convince the Nazi officer commanding that day's sweep to let us go. Had she arrived a few minutes later, it would have been too late. Because if my mom had arrived a few minutes later, my fate would have been like the little boy that you see right there. Because from here, these people were taken directly to freight yards, next slide please, put on freight cars, cattle cars, and shipped directly to concentration camps. And all children, most women, and all the older or weaker men would be almost immediately sent to the gas chambers. So if my mom had come a few minutes later, I would not be here with you guys today. I would have been murdered decades and decades ago. Pure luck. What happened next? Let me just see something. Okay. My mom was a very smart woman. She realized that the days of the ghetto, oh, I know it. Okay, yeah, oh yeah. Next slide, please. Right. I mentioned that if people were lucky when they were being forced into the ghetto, they would move in with friends or relatives, like the dozen people that moved into our apartment. Well, what if they weren't lucky? What if they didn't know anyone? They would have to live on the street. And Warsaw is a northern city, like Boston, Toronto, Seattle. It's not a good place to be living in the street, particularly in the winter. And because of that, during the 2.5 years of the ghetto's existence, 80,000 people died within the walls of the ghetto. They died from starvation, they died from disease, they died from exposure to the elements in winter. And I remember many a winter morning, I'd wake up to a sound, something like a clunk, 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 clunk. It was the sound of a wooden wagon that was being pulled over the cobblestone streets of the ghetto by men. They were picking up bodies of people who had died during the night and taking the bodies out. The ghetto was not a good place to live. It was not a good place to die. Here you see a couple of kids sitting on the street, freezing, begging for food. There was no food to be given. We were all starving. Next slide, please. My mom was a very smart woman, and she realized sooner than most people that the days of the ghetto and everybody in it were numbered. So she decided to try to get us to safety where there was still a chance. In the first place in our flight to safety is a place I called the Shed. And the reason I put that on the cover of my book is that that's a view from the Shed that I still remember and had a major effect on my adult life, my professional life. So I'll read to you a chapter called The Shed. We can only speak in whispers here, my grandmother told me. We were now in a large shed with corrugated metal walls and seating, pieces of rusting metal equipment strewn about, now bags and blankets on the floor. Several families were here with us, no one that I recognize, all with bags and suitcases and blankets. One family even had a little black dachshund, and the owners told us that he never barks. I petted his soft fur and I played with him. Some of the people played cards, some knitted, but no one spoke except in very quiet whispers. My grandmother took some bread and sausage from her bag, made tea on a little chemical burner, and that was our dinner. When it got dark, no one lit any candles. We wrapped ourselves in our blankets and we slept. I woke up in the morning and I wanted to play with the little black dachshund, but it was gone. So I asked its owners, where is it? And their only answer to me was, it's gone. Years later, my mom told me that during the night, its owners had to choke it to death to keep it from barking at footsteps outside the shed. If you have a small dog or a pet, can you imagine choking it to death in your own lap? I can't. The day, or perhaps many days, went by slowly in the near silence, the only sounds coming from outside the shed. Once I saw an airplane with black crosses on its wings flying across the sky, just exactly what you see that were there. That's a scene I remember when we were hiding in the shed. At that time, I didn't know that it was a Nazi airplane, and the black crosses were Nazi insignia. It just looked so beautiful to me against the blue sky. It wasn't constrained in a dark shed, as I was. And I felt strangely drawn to it. I wanted to be in it. I wanted to be somehow with it. I never lost that interest in airplanes. A few years later, after the war, I would read Polish aviation magazines. Then later on, after we moved to America, and I went to high school in Oregon, I would build and fly model airplanes. In college, I majored in aeronautical engineering. Then I worked in the aerospace industry. I took flying lessons, got a private pilot's license, crashed an airplane and walked away from it without a scratch. And for 20-some years, I flew hang gliders in Southern California. Crashed maybe half a dozen times, walked away unhurt from all but the last one. And on that one, I crashed near the top of a mountain near LA. I woke up in a hospital 6 hours later. And for my next birthday, my wife gave me a present. It was a video taken from a newsreel helicopter showing a rescue helicopter lifting me unconscious by cable from the top of the mountain where I crashed and taking me to the hospital. That was her birthday present for me. And she reminds me of it whenever she thinks I get too cocky. So, well, where is it? Okay. Anyway, that was the shed. What happened next? From the shed, my mom put my grandmother into what she thought was a safe hiding place. Turns out it wasn't, but we learned that only after the war. So thinking that my grandmother was safe, my mom smuggled herself and me out of the ghetto. What happened in the ghetto after we left? Enough information, including some eyewitnesses, managed to smuggle themselves back into the ghetto to warn everyone that those who were being shipped out were going to concentration camps, and most of them were dying in gas chambers. So a group of young civilians, 300, 400, 500, doesn't matter, young people, no military training. They knew that by that time the Nazis had tightened up the security around the walls, so escape from the ghetto was impossible. This was some months after we left. Escape from the ghetto was impossible. So these people within the ghetto could no longer deny that they knew what was going to happen, that they were going to die in gas chambers. So a group of young civilians decided that they would rather die fighting than die in the gas chambers. And the stage what became known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now imagine a group of young civilians, 300, 400, 500, no military training. They had some rifles and some pistols hidden in the ghetto, and they rose up against a trained Nazi army of thousands of soldiers with tanks and artillery and airplanes. The ghetto fighters knew they had no chance. They knew that they would all die, and they all died. It was truly a hopeless, hopeless act of defiance. So they fought for about 2 or 3 weeks, and every one of them was killed. Next slide, please. This is a photo of the end of the ghetto. Every man, woman, and child that remained in the ghetto was killed by German troops. And apparently Hitler was so furious and so apparently personally insulted the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto dared to rise up against his army. He ordered the army to level every building within the ghetto. Next slide, please. This is a panoramic shot of the ghetto. All the ruins in the front are the ruins of the ghetto as destroyed by the Nazi army. The black line in the back, those are the buildings of Warsaw right outside the walls of the ghetto. How did my mom and I get out of there? Next slide, please. This is a photo of my mom when she was 7 years old, dressed up with her brother. It was the only photo that my mom managed to save of herself and anyone in her family because she kept it under her blouse all the years of the war. My mom was a very smart woman. She was a young attorney before the war. And at the university, she learned English and she learned French. So the first thing she did when she got herself out of the ghetto, herself and me out of the ghetto, she dyed her black hair blonde because most Poles have hair that either light brown or dark blonde. So she dyed her hair blonde. And she bought the identification papers of a young Polish Catholic woman who had died, and her name was Śliwowska. Śliwowska is considered a Polish Catholic name. Elbaum apparently was considered a Jewish name. So my mom took on the woman's name. And the next time my mom saw me, because I didn't live with her once we were out of the ghetto, I'll tell you about it in a minute. My mom Every time she would have she would change to a new set of fake ID papers. She would have a new name, and then next time she would see me, she would tell me what my new name was, and I always had to remember the last name and forget the previous name. So, with fake ID papers, with blonde hair, my mom went to work. First, she had some good jobs. She became an English governess or French governess to wealthy Poles who wanted the kids to learn those languages. When those jobs ended, my mom took on whatever was available. That included becoming a cook, a maid, a scrub woman, a laundress, whatever. As long as the job came with two benefits. Benefit number one, room and board in the house of the people who hired her. And the reason that was critical is that she wouldn't have to walk to work back and forth every day, because every time she was on the street, she could be picked up by Nazi patrol or police and sent to concentration camps, fake papers or not. Requirement number two, a little bit of cash, not for herself, but to pay to the people who are keeping me. Because my mom decided that I would be safer if I was raised by Polish Catholic families with one of theirs. My mom tells me that throughout my childhood, 3, 4, 5, and 6 years old, all through the war, my hair was light brown, and I didn't look Jewish. It was only after the war, when I turned 7 and 8, within 2 years, my hair went from light brown to black like hers. So I was being kept by these Polish Catholic families. And my mom would move me from one family to the next. Whenever the family with whom I was living alerted her danger to me and danger to them. Because in Poland, the Nazis decreed that any Poles found hiding Jews, including little kids like me, would be immediately sent to concentration camps along with the Jews that were hiding. So I want to ask you a challenge question. I'd like you to think about it, but think about it and answer it honestly, but only to yourself, not to anybody else. Imagine that it's now, so let's say, I just want to add this. The people that were keeping me, they weren't doing it for the little bit of cash that my mom would pay them, because she was getting pittance in cash, plus she was getting room and board. But she gave them all the money she was making for keeping me. So the families weren't keeping me for the money. They were keeping me because they knew they were in danger. They were keeping me because they thought it was the right thing to do. So I'm asking you a challenge question. Imagine it's now 20 years in the future. You guys are finished with your education. You're working for some company in this area. It's a great job. You love it. You're doing a great job. The company offers you a major promotion. They have a foreign office, big profit center, and they offer you to be the general manager of that office if you move to that country and manage it from there. And it's a great opportunity, so you accept it. But when you get there, you learn that the government of that country they are prejudiced against a small minority. They're arresting them, throwing them in jails, beating them, killing them. And you know that you could take one of them. Imagine you could take a little skinny, undernourished 4-year-old kid, as I was at that time, if you took him or her into your house or apartment. But you might be risking maybe your life. Would you do it? Would you do it? Answer that only to yourself, please, but answer it honestly. Would you do it? But the 4 or 5 different families that took me in, they took that risk. And that is the only reason I'm here alive speaking to you today, because they saved me. And I'm forever grateful. They weren't always nice to me, but they always saved me. The last family with whom I lived was headed by a man named Leon. This is the only name I remember, just his first name. I don't remember his last name. I don't remember the names of any of the others. I think I remember his name because I liked him. He was always fair to me, and that was to me was a critical factor. He was kind some of the time, but he was also tough, because whenever I disobeyed him, if I did something I wasn't supposed to do, he beat me, and it hurt. But I always knew why he was beating me. I knew what I did that he told me not to do, and if it involved eating some food that I wasn't supposed to touch when I was alone in the apartment, and I was very hungry. Sometimes it was even worth the beating because I was really hungry. So I still like Leon. I didn't like his wife or their little daughter, maybe a year younger than I. because whenever my mom would visit me, then maybe once a month, once every several months. The last time I didn't see my mom for 6 months. My mom would bring me a present. It might be a little wooden toy, or it might be a hard-boiled egg, which was a very nice present in wartime Poland when everybody, or most everybody, was hungry. And my mom always made sure that I ate the hard-boiled egg in her presence. She wanted to make sure that I got it. But after my mom would leave, Leon's wife very often would take away the little toy that my mom brought me and gave it to their daughter to play with, so I didn't like them. Now, I was with Leon from beginning of 1944 through the end of that year. That included August 44, time of the Warsaw Uprising. Now, the Warsaw Uprising differed in one very fundamental way from the Ghetto Uprising. The Ghetto Uprising, which was in April 43, the fighters knew they had no chance. They knew they would all die, and they all died. What's a year and a half later, the Warsaw Uprising involved all of Warsaw, involved about 20,000 Polish fighters who had weapons that were parachuted to them from London. So they thought they had a chance. Turns out, for different reasons, including the perfidy of Russians, the Nazis put down the uprising in about 3-4 months. Next slide, please. This is a photo of Warsaw right outside right after the uprising. It was a total ruin. Now, how did Leon and his family and I get out of there in time? Leon must have learned that somehow learned that the uprising was going to take place. So the day before the uprising, the uprising started 1st of August of 1944. And the day before, he got somewhere, a pedal powder rickshaw. And he and his wife packed up some suitcases and boxes, put them on the baggage compartment of the rickshaw. And on the 1st of August, as the uprising was starting, with his wife and daughter and I sitting on the baggage in front, Leon pedaling in the back, we left the city. The Warsaw Uprising had just started. We were somewhere already in the country. Grain fields everywhere. The fighting in Warsaw was way behind us. Leon stopped to rest along the side of the road. And I asked him where we were going. He says, "We're going to my cousin's farm." I wandered away along a ditch that ran beside the road, and there all of a sudden I noticed lying in the grass a dark blue object, something like a large potato, dark blue, just lying there. So I picked it up and it felt cold and heavy, like metal, and had a ring on one end of it. I started to play with it. I put my finger through the ring, and I pulled on it, and it came out in my hand just as Leon called that we were leaving. So I tossed the object over my shoulder. I was standing next to a ditch, so it fell in the ditch, and I ran to the rickshaw. As I jumped on it, there was a loud explosion from where I had just been. And Leon started pedaling furiously, much faster than before. He didn't know what I had done, but he knew that any Poles found by the Nazis near weapons or explosives would have been shot on the spot. And only later did I realize that object was a Nazi hand grenade. And again, if Leon had called me a few seconds later, again, I wouldn't be here with you guys today. So pure luck. I was with Leon and his family on that farm through the end of the year. That was 1944. And in the first week of January, all of a sudden, my mother appeared. I had not seen her for 6 months, so I didn't know when I would see her, or even if I allowed myself to think about it, whether I would ever see her again. So that moment was probably the happiest of my childhood moments, seeing my mother alive after 6 months. I have no idea how she found me. And about a week or so later, all of a sudden, I remember I was sleeping. We were all on this farm. She woke me up, and she had tears in her eyes, and she said to me, "You are saved." And I had no idea what she was talking about, but she took my hand, pulled me out of bed, and dragged me to the main room in the farmhouse. And there were soldiers there, but they didn't have the dark green uniforms of the Nazis, the olive uniforms. So my mom bent down to me and said, "They're Russian." Well, that didn't mean anything to me. I've never heard of Russia or Russians before. But when one of the Russian soldiers saw me, I was the only little kid in the room. I was 6 years old. He reached into his pocket, took out a little white cube, and he handed it to me like that. But I didn't know what it was. So my mom said, "Take it, take it. It's sugar, taste it." So I put it in my mouth, and I swear it was the best taste I've ever had in my whole life. And since that moment, I have a tremendous sweet tooth. I can start dinner with dessert, have dessert for the main course, and end it with dessert. And the only reason I don't do it is because my wife never lets me. I mean, I know she's right, but I do have this tremendous sweet tooth that started with that one little lousy, wonderful sugar cube. I call that moment the sugar miracle. Anyway, let's see. About a week or two later, we learned that the Russian army had pushed the Nazis out of Warsaw. So my mom and I returned to Warsaw, mostly by walking, occasionally hitching a ride on a military truck. And Warsaw looked like that, except it was a very snowy winter, so there were a lot of snow and snowdrifts covering the ruins. And occasionally here and there I could see a body or two left over from the battle between the Nazis and the Russians. And because my mom had been an attorney before the war, she almost immediately got a job with a brand new book publishing company that the Polish communist government started to print books and propaganda. And her job was to go around the country and reopen the bookstores that had been closed during the war. Now, those that, in order to reach some of those further cities, she needed transport. Public transport wasn't available, so she was given a car and a driver. She didn't drive. Now, the little car was only semi-car. It was an old German three-wheeler, each wheel about half the size of a normal car wheel, one in the front, two in the back. Was always breaking down. The driver was always fixing it. The driver was given a machine gun. She was given a pistol. And the reason for that was that whereas in the Warsaw region, the Nazis had wiped out most of the 20,000 fighters who were loyal to the pro-Western government in England, pro-Western Polish government in England. My mom and her driver occasionally needed to go to some further away cities where there were still pockets of pro-Western underground resisting the communist takeover, and they knew that only the government owned cars, so they would attack cars on the road. Luckily, my mom and her driver never needed to use their weapons. Next slide, please. This is a photo of my mom and me, the summer of 1945. The little three-wheeler must have died, so she was given a Jeep. There's a good story behind that, but I won't get into it because we're short of time. Next slide.
George?
Yeah.
We want 15 minutes for questions. We got about 5 minutes.
Okay, quickly. Okay, never mind. Skip that because that's another thing that goes past, Nick. In 1949, the second time, all of a sudden, my mom was sent to Paris to establish Polish bookstores in France, and she took me with her because she couldn't leave me with anybody else. I turned 11. This could be my birthday picture, August of 1949. Next slide. Okay. When we were in Paris, my mom defected, went to the American embassy, applied for a visa for herself and for me. Her visa came through quickly, mine didn't. So my mom had to again park me with somebody in Paris. And for a couple of months, I lived with some strangers. After 2 months, they put me on an airplane. Then we went to my mom met me in New York. We went to North Carolina. I went into 6th grade. I didn't speak a word of English. Nobody there spoke Polish. The first few weeks were horrible because I kept making very embarrassing mistakes. The funniest mistake is also the most embarrassing, and that's when the kids try to teach me baseball. Ask me about it during QA because it was now it's very funny, then it was very embarrassing. Everybody there spoke English with a hell of an English Southern accent. I learned English from them. I didn't pick it up. My only explanation is my Polish accent was so heavy that it kind of kept the Southern accent away. After a year and a half, we moved to Oregon. This is Forest Grove in the back. Okay, anyway, back up one. Yeah, this is high school. Moved to Oregon. My mom right away took me to the principal of the little high school, maybe 300 kids. He gave me an oral test to see how much, whether I spoke English well enough, whether I understood it, what I knew, and apparently I passed it. So he allowed me to skip 8th grade and start as a freshman. Freshman year was very tough on me. This is my freshman photo, Forest Grove High School in 1951. It was a very difficult year for me because, first of all, I was only a year and a half in America, so I didn't understand, feel American culture. I kept making mistakes, social mistakes, not as bad as in North Carolina, but very embarrassing anyway. I had a heavy Polish accent. I was the only kid in the school with a foreign accent. Number 3, I started to stutter badly, really badly, and it was very embarrassing. It's only, I realized later, it's because the memories of the Holocaust started to register in my head. After 4 years, I better skip the thing about the car. Yeah, after 4 years in high school, I went to my math teacher asking what's a good college for aeronautical engineering, because ever since then I wanted something to do with airplanes. He said, well, the best one's MIT. Never heard of MIT before, and no idea it was difficult to get into. It was very naive. It was the only college I applied to, which was stupid, but I was stupid in that sense. I was also lucky, once again, and I got in. Altogether, I spent 8.5 years in 3 different sequences. I got a bachelor's after the first one, then I worked in the aerospace industry, got a couple of masters after the next one, and finally, once again, a PhD after the last one. Then I worked in the aerospace industry for 30-some years, and then I started commuting between California and Moscow, representing American companies in Russia. And I kept the Holocaust at an emotional distance. I never talked about it. None of my high school classmates ever knew about my background because I saw what the Holocaust did to my mom. Even though she was a very successful businesswoman in America, she was traumatized by the Holocaust, till her dying day, which was like 19 years ago. And I didn't want that to happen to me. But finally, like in 2009, my wife asked me if it's okay to rent a movie called Paperclips. It's a documentary, takes place in Tennessee in 2000 and something. And it doesn't show any Holocaust scenes, but it's about the Holocaust. So my wife said, I know you don't want to see any Holocaust scenes. This is all takes place long after the war is over. It takes place in Tennessee. I said, sure, rent it. When the movie ended, I realized one scene in it made me realize that my story has value. So when my wife asked me whether I would reconsider my refusal to write a book about my childhood, surprised her, I surprised myself. I said, I'll do it. Started the next day, finished 3 months later. And I thought I was finished. No more Holocaust, anything for me. But at that time, my best friend who lives here in Boston, who is sitting right over there, Bill, I'm talking about you. He knew that I was writing the book, and that and he told it to the organizer of the Holocaust Memorial on Holocaust Remembrance Day, and because he opened his mouth, she dragged me in, and first I said hell no because I was afraid. I didn't like the idea of being afraid, so I practiced, and he was at the time when I finally said yes, and on the 10th of April 2010, which was the Holocaust Remembrance Day, I spoke my very first time to an audience, maybe about this size, all MIT people, plus some friends. Thank you, Bill. That got me started. And since then, they also introduced me to facing history and ourselves. And since then, I've spoken about 360 times. I have a website. Every time I speak to a class, a group like yours, I put it on a website, and this will be on the website, including some photographs. But by the way, out of the 300 and some, or the website tells me how many I've already done. It's about 360 something. And 90-some% of my talks are to high schools or middle schools. And the reason for that is that you guys are old enough to understand what I lived through, what I survived, but yet you're young enough to have an open mind, to decide for yourself whether you want to live your life on the side of anger and hate and prejudice and violence, or on the side of truth and fairness and respect. That's a choice you might have made if you ever were walking and you saw somebody being bullied. What did you do? Just keep walking and let the bullying continue? Or did you stop and face the bully and say, hey, stop that? That took some courage. But you made a choice. Later on, you might be in a tougher situation. You might see mob actions, beatings, maybe even killings. it happens in the world now. It happened in the U.S. some years ago. There was a march, an anti-Semitic march in Charlottesville, Virginia. One person was killed. Unfortunately, when our then President Trump was asked about it, he says, well, there's some very fine people on both sides. No, there are no fine people on the sides of anger and hate and prejudice. All the fine people are on the side of truth and fairness and respect. And I've spoken in colleges since then, and the kind of questions I get asked is, what can we as individuals do, to counter prejudice? And my only answer is, face the person, whether it's a bully or whoever, and say to them, hey, I want to hear that racist joke again. Tell it to me again. I want my friends to hear it too. Usually they'll back off. Not always, but usually they'll back off. So essentially, if given the situation, I hope all you guys will become upstanders rather than bystanders. That's why I'm here today, hoping that what I've said to you will stick. And if you're in a situation where you have to make a choice of being an upstander or being a silent bystander, I hope you choose the active and speak up. I very much hope you do that. Thank you. Questions?
So we have a mic here for any questions. Thank you so much, George. I think a lot of our classes focus on, and we're not packing up just yet, a lot of our classes focus on thinking about what we do in a situation where we could help somebody potentially, or we could walk away and pretend that it's not happening. And I think George's message lines up perfectly with a lot of what we talk about in class, right? The choices we make are really important and can impact us forever. So we really have to think about how we're helping people, right? We're contributing to humankind in a positive way. All those messages that we like to send you in class too. So we have time for just a few questions. Does anybody have a question for George?
Let me point out, the first person to ask the question is the bravest person in the room, right there.
There we go.
Hey, good. You're the bravest person in the room.
Based off everything you've experienced, what would you give us high school students as advice?
Based on what you've gone through, that experience, what kind of advice would you have to high school students?
Well, my advice and hope for you is to become an upstander. I've not faced prejudice. I've not faced anti-Semitism. Sorry. Yeah. I've been lucky. I've not faced anti-Semitism. At least I wasn't aware of it. I know in some areas it's easy to become aware of that. For whatever reason, maybe I'm just blind to it. But the only time I faced prejudice in America had to do with racism. And I remember this situation that I was in the United States only few weeks. And for some reason, from this little town in North Carolina, where we were living, it was 1,000 population. The nearest two cities were both 20, 30,000. My mom dropped me off in one of those two cities. I was supposed to take a bus, two, three stops, and she told, I didn't speak English, but she told the bus driver where to drop me off. So I got on the bus, and there was some people in the front. There was nobody in the back. So I kind of wandered over to the back and sat down. The driver yelled. I had no idea he was yelling at me. So then he stopped the bus, got up, and he was facing me and said, "Hey, you." All I could do was say, "No English, no English." He came over. I was a little kid. I was 11, but I was very small. He picked me up on my shoulders, picked me up, carried me forward, and plopped me down one of the front seats. I had no idea what that was all about. So I asked my mom, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, here in the South, the front is reserved for whites and the back is reserved for blacks." And I remember saying to my mom, "I thought America was a democracy." And she said, "Well, it's not a perfect democracy." So that was the one time that I really saw that America was not a perfect democracy, and prejudice still, whether it's anti-Semitism or anti-black, still very much here. And unfortunately, when sometimes it's abetted by high administration officials, that's a shame. That's a shame. Next.
All right.
Good.
All right. What were some coping go sorry. What were some coping mechanisms you used during when you like traveled with or like moved to different families taking care of you?
What were the coping mechanisms?
Yeah.
Well, I was at that time, 4 and 5 years old, and I had no idea of what is happening on the outside. All I knew was, the first time that I was moved, apparently the family with whom I was living, maybe they didn't treat me very well. I was afraid the next one was going to be worse. And I remember this was winter, and I threw a fit. It was at nighttime. My mom had been warned, so she took me from there and was taking me apparently to the next place. And I threw a fit in the snow. It was evening, and curfew was coming. But I had no idea what was happening outside, and I had no idea why my mom was parking me in different families. Truly, ignorance was bliss for me. And luckily, that's a part of that situation. I have a chapter in my books called "The Beggar and the Burlap Bag," because I threw this big fit on the street, thrashing in the snow. No, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. And this old beggar was walking by. In Poland, there's this, the boogeyman type thing that a beggar will come along and put you in his burlap bag and take you away. And this beggar bent down to me and said, "Little boy," because curfew was coming, so it was dangerous. So this beggar bent down and said, "Little boy, do what your mom tells you, or I'm going to put you in my bag and carry you away." I instantly stopped crying, and my mom took me to wherever it was that she was taking me. But she always learned from one place to another, because there was an organization in Warsaw that traced Jewish kids that were being parked with Catholic families, and when there was a movement, then a parent or somebody else would come along and move them to the next one. But I had no idea. I didn't know I was Jewish until after the war. I'll just tell you exactly how that happened. War ended. I was 7 years old, and I was playing in Warsaw, and I was playing with some other kids, neighboring kids in the courtyard, and one of the kids called somebody a dirty Jew. And I remember I'm very liberal now, I was very liberal then. I remember saying to this friend of mine, neighbor, I said, "Hey, don't say that," because I said, there are good Poles and bad Poles, there are good Jews and bad Jews. I said, "You and I are good Poles, but there's some pretty bad Poles too. And there are some pretty bad Jews and good Jews." And he didn't agree with me. And we started arguing, and we started fighting. And he got bloody, and I got bloody. And that's when my mom learned about it. She decided that's a good time to tell me that I was Jewish. Well, I was willing to fight for the Jews, but I didn't want to be one, because at that time I knew what happened to Jews during the war. I threw a fit. I started crying. I didn't want to be a Jew. But I got over it. And I guess the time that I feel most Jewish, I'm not religious, but the time that I feel most Jewish is when I'm speaking in a place like Poland, when I know there's some anti-Semites, when I get, by accident or on purpose, get to meet some of the kids and find out that, like one kid came up to me afterwards after he got my book in Poland. And I don't speak Polish, but they all speak English when I speak in Poland. And he said to me, he said, "Oh, I know." He said, "I didn't want to be here because you're a Jew and I hate Jews. But because my grandfather hates Jews, but I don't know why he hates them." And he says, he wanted me to sign the book I was giving him. And he and I started talking and laughing together. And I'll bet that he will not grow up to be anti-Semitic. So these are the kind of moments that I cherish when I see someone become more open-minded. Next.
I think we are out of time. The bell's going to ring in a minute. So, guys, one more big round of applause for George, thanking him. So you guys can just hang tight until the bell rings, okay? So stay in your seats. Thank you for being such a respectful audience. And George, thank you again. That was awesome.